Growing up, my older brother Dan, 32M, was my role model, my confidant, and my protector. I'm Lisa, 28F, and since childhood, Dan and I shared everything, from laughs and family secrets to the countless adventures we embarked on together. He was that kind of brother you look up to, one who made me feel safe, no matter the circumstance. Dan was the reliable, upstanding guy in the family, and when he met Julia, 31F, I thought he'd met his match. Julia was perfect, kind, witty, and incredibly supportive of Dan's dreams and quirks. They started dating 4 years ago, and seeing their bond solidified brought me genuine happiness. When they announced their engagement, I was ecstatic. I remember helping Julia pick out flower arrangements and sending her links to wedding gown designs. Dan and Julia's wedding was a beautiful day, the kind of ceremony that felt like a fairy tale. Dan looked happier than I'd ever seen him, and I was proud of him. Seeing him find love and stability filled me with joy. Over time, Julia became like a sister to me. So, when they told me they were expecting a baby, I could barely contain my excitement. Dan was over the moon about becoming a dad, and I felt like I was watching my brother step into a new, fulfilling chapter of his life. But as Julia's pregnancy progressed, small cracks began to show. Dan, who once would drop everything to help Julia, became increasingly distracted, often glued to his phone. He'd brush off our family when we'd ask how he and Julia were doing, saying he was busy with work. At first, I thought he was just nervous about fatherhood, that the looming responsibility was maybe overwhelming him. But Julia confided in me, mentioning how distant he'd been, even as she entered her 3rd trimester. Something was definitely off, and I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in my gut. One night, Julia called me in tears, her voice trembling. She'd found messages between Dan and another woman, an affair that wasn't just recent, but ongoing for several months. She told me how she confronted him, how he tried to play it off as a harmless fling, something that meant nothing. I was floored. The Dan I knew, the responsible, caring big brother, was nowhere to be found. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying the pain in Julia's voice. The next morning, I couldn't keep quiet. I called Dan, demanding an explanation. He was defensive, dismissing my anger as me meddling in his business. He admitted to the affair but downplayed it, saying it was a temporary lapse, and he swore it was over. He brushed off my concerns, claiming Julia was overreacting. His indifference, his callousness toward the mother of his unborn child, was heartbreaking. I could barely recognize him. In the following weeks, Dan promised Julia he'd cut ties with the other woman and focus on their relationship. Julia, ever hopeful and strong, decided to give him another chance. She wanted to rebuild their family for the sake of their unborn child, and part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, Dan would come to his senses. I wanted to believe he'd see the harm he'd caused and change, but I wasn't convinced. However, my doubts were confirmed soon enough. Julia reached out again, distraught, sharing screenshots of new messages she'd found. Dan hadn't ended the affair, he'd just gotten better at hiding it. He had taken to sneaking around, lying to her face, pretending to be the caring husband. I couldn't believe the lengths he was going to deceive her. When I confronted him again, he was angry, accusing me of siding with Julia and turning against family. The betrayal ran so deep that even our bond as siblings felt tainted. Our parents, upon hearing about the situation, tried to calm things down. They brushed off his actions as a phase, saying that marriage is hard work, and urged Julia to keep trying. I was shocked at their reaction. Here was their son blatantly betraying his pregnant wife, and they were more concerned with keeping up appearances. They tried to convince me to drop it, claiming that family comes first, no matter the situation. Dan and Julia separated shortly after, with Julia moving in with her parents for support. She was devastated, not just because of Dan's actions, but because of the family she felt she'd lost. I stayed by her side, feeling torn between loyalty to my brother and my moral obligation to support Julia. The heartbreak in her eyes each time we talked was unbearable. Around this time, Julia found that Dan had been secretly siphoning funds from their joint account. Money meant for their baby's future was being spent on luxury dates and gifts for his mistress. This wasn't just a simple mistake, it was a deliberate betrayal. I knew I had to stand up for Julia, so I told her everything I knew, which pushed her to move forward with divorce proceedings. Dan was furious, accusing me of betraying the family, claiming I'd destroyed his life. He refused to take accountability, still seeing himself as the victim. Months passed, and the divorce was messy, as expected. Julia fought for custody and a fair share of assets, wanting to protect her child's future. Meanwhile, Dan spun a narrative of victimhood, making it seem like Julia was the unreasonable one. Our parents continued to support Dan, going as far as to ask me to patch things up with him. They refused to acknowledge the pain he'd caused, dismissing my stance as overly judgmental. One day, my mom sat me down, telling me that I was tearing the family apart by taking Julia's side. She insisted that blood is thicker than water, and that we should stand by Dan, regardless of his choices. I couldn't believe it. The more I tried to defend my actions, the more I felt like an outcast in my own family. They couldn't see the harm Dan had done, and it made me question everything I thought I knew about loyalty. As Julia's child was born, she began to rebuild her life. Watching her find strength in the midst of so much pain was inspiring. I stayed close, helping her in whatever way I could, and our friendship grew even stronger. Meanwhile, Dan continued to blame me for his failed marriage. He'd show up at family gatherings, casting me cold glares, refusing to engage with me directly. The final blow came when my parents called a family meeting to address the ongoing tension. They tried to guilt me into reaching out to Dan, telling me that siblings should stick together. They even suggested that I apologize to him for getting too involved. It felt surreal. How could they ask me to apologize to someone who'd shown no remorse for breaking his family apart? I held firm, telling them I couldn't forgive Dan until he took responsibility for his actions. They were furious, telling me I'd lost touch with family values. I left that day feeling like an outsider, the black sheep, the only one willing to hold Dan accountable. But I knew in my heart that I was doing the right thing. Julia, on the other hand, continued to thrive. She got a new job, found stability, and raised her child with grace and strength. Every time I saw her with her baby, I felt a surge of pride. She'd endured so much and still managed to move forward, creating a loving home for her child. The bond between us became unbreakable, and though it was a painful journey, I was grateful for the friendship that had emerged. Over the years, my relationship with Dan remained strained. Our parents would occasionally mention his name, dropping hints that I should reach out, but I never did. I'd made my choice, and I knew it was the right one. Dan, who once had everything, a loving wife, a child on the way, and a supportive family, had thrown it all away, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Even now, my family urges me to make amends, to let go for the sake of unity. But I can't bring myself to ignore the pain he caused, the hurt he inflicted without remorse. It's a painful truth to accept, but sometimes, the hardest thing to do is the right thing.